Karim, who's come here from San Jose State, and once again, I'm embarrassed to say we've got such a tiny group, but I blame it on several things: the gorgeous weather, total exhaustion in the semester, and the admitted students day. So all of that, right? But we're really, really happy that you guys have come, and really, really happy to have her here. And there's some copies of books that she's edited and also done some writing in that are in the gift shop. She's a professor again at San Jose, and you also lead the Persian Studies program at San Jose. And is it in comparative literature as well? In English, comparative literature. And I think she's written some poems specifically for this event, inspired by some of the work. So that's very special. I'm really happy that she's flown all the way here on a red eye. Thank you very much for
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
It's great to see you. I'm happy to be here. Last night I was at an event in San Francisco and there were 7 people, so you guys are close rivals. Hopefully it's not because of me. So when Elizabeth invited me to come to speak, she sent me some of the images from this show. And the thing that I think that really leaps out at me as a viewer is the idea that these are works that both play with the iconography and images of Iran and a tradition of art in Iran, but also update it in a new context, in a U.S. or a hybrid context. And that speaks to me personally because that's the place where I entered the work that I've done as a writer and editor. I went to graduate school at the University of Texas at Austin, and I did Middle East Studies and Comparative Literature. And I was really interested in literature of the modern Middle East, but I realized as I was studying Iran and Iranian writers, what I was really looking for was my own story, a story that spoke to some of my experiences as a child of an Iranian father, and my mother was from France, and they met in the U.S. And I was born long before the big migration of Iranians after the '79 revolution. So I kind of grew up with that very in-between sensibility, which I think a lot of these works kind of speak to some of that in-betweenness. So more recently, though, I've been working as an editor collecting literature by Iranian-American writers. And there was no literature of that immigrant group until the first anthology, which is out there, it's called The World Between, was the first anthology collecting the stories of Iranians in the North American context. Those stories in some ways are punctuated by the experiences of loss and migration, the war between Iran and Iraq, families being separated, and a kind of nostalgia for what was in Iran before the '79 revolution, when the Islamic Republic was established, and when everything really changed for people. And many of the poems and stories and memoirs that have been written since like the mid-1980s have really shown an evolution from people who left Iran to those children of the immigrants and then maybe the second generation. So I've been really privileged, I think, to see that evolution in the literature, and the kind of quality of the writing is really outstanding now. The last collection that I worked on was called Tremors, New Fiction by Iranian-American Writers. And what I sort of have witnessed is the idea that new immigrants often write first-person narratives, memoirs, maybe poetry, and as they become more entrenched in the culture of their new homes, they develop a more sophisticated narrative about their experience that's much more universal and maybe also embodies the idea of the fictional narrative much more than the first-person narrative. So that's really one of the things that I've seen in the last 6 or 7 years, is like a really outstanding quality of fiction writing. Because the artists that you see in this room are women, and in some ways I think you can see almost all the images, with the exception of maybe Mohammed creating himself from the mud, and a few of Samira's. Most of them feature female images, which is a really wonderful thing, because Iranian traditional painting and art until the 20th century was dominated by men, and was dominated by images of men, and women were often portrayed in very docile and beautiful ways, but without that sense of empowerment, that women had a narrative themselves. They were just the object of a male gaze. And the same is true for literature, that in Iran, it's only in the mid-20th century that women writers really entered the stage and began to get a lot of recognition. So I did a little PowerPoint just to give you the context, because I think it's really important to understand that what has happened to Iranian-Americans or Iranian immigrants is that in some ways they're rewriting the narratives of the old country and borrowing from the old traditions, but also updating them for new contexts. And the same is true for literature. So go ahead and, am I in your way? Okay. This is one of the most, I have to figure out where I'm going to sit. I'll have my back to you. In Persian they say, excuse me for having my back to you, and then the person says, your back is a flower. So
your back is a flower.
Your back is a flower.
This is one of the most important contemporary 20th century writers, Farooq Farrokhzad. She sort of broke the mold because poetry in the early 20th century was dominated by men, and she wrote about women's desires and interests in a way that no one had previously done before. She was such an outstanding poet that she got recognition, but many men were suspicious, jealous, and she ended up having a very short career. She was killed in a car accident in the early 60s. But she really changed the possibility for women in Iran in terms of her writing. And this is one of her most famous poems called Sin. I have sinned a rapturous sin in a warm and flamed embrace, sinned in a pair of vindictive arms, arms violent or blaze. In that quiet, vacant dark, I looked into his mystic eyes, found such longing that my heart fluttered impatient in my breast. In that quiet, vacant dark, I sat beside him, punch-drunk, his lips released desire on mine, grief unclenched my crazy heart. And this was like a kind of revolutionary spirit for a woman to speak of her own desires and her own passions, because Iran is a very, has been and continues to be a very patriarchal culture. And the idea of women being demure and quiet and solicitous towards men is more the expectation. And she changed that by writing about women's experiences and desires. So I wanted to sort of point out, that she's sort of the foremother for many women writers in both the Iranian context, but also very beloved outside of Iran. And now her work has been translated. My friend Sholay recently translated her work, and it's not easy to translate good Persian poetry, but she's done a really good job. Yeah.
Do you mind if we?
No, please. That's more fun.
Okay. Was she published in her lifetime in Iran?
Yes.
My goodness.
She was, and she also was a really phenomenal filmmaker. She made a really interesting film called The House is Black. She was married to an Iranian filmmaker, and she made it. It's a documentary about a leper colony in Iran. I can't recommend it enough. It's really fantastic. And she narrates it with some of her own poetry.
There are a lot of very good Iranian women filmmakers.
Yes,
It's a rich,
outstanding, yeah. So she's one of the sort of foremothers that I wanted to mention.
Sure.
Go to the next. Another female writer who also broke the mold is Simin Daneshvar. She passed away about 3 years ago. She wrote a novel called Sabushun, which has a female protagonist, and it deals with the occupation of Iran during the Second World War. Iran was occupied by the Russians in the north and the British in the south, and they divided up the country and were occupying Iran for about 4 years. And it was really, this novel in some ways really asserted a female character who also had a political sensibility. So I point to her as somebody who really articulated women's place in a sort of political way as well. And that's the cover. Because women were, in the modern period under the Shah, between about 1945 until 79 when the Shah fell, there were a number of efforts to modernize the country, to create educational institutions, and to give women more positions in society, both professionally and educationally. However, the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, had a very patronizing view of Iran. So while Iran has undergone lots of changes in the 20th century and the 21st century, by and large it's still a deeply patriarchal society, and the view of women, I think, is deeply embedded in a patriarchal view. So Pahlavi wrote, women, look, let's put it this way, I don't underrate them. They profited more than anyone else from my white revolution. I fought strenuously so that they'd have equal rights and responsibilities. I've even put them in the army where they get military training for 6 months and then are sent to the villages to fight the battle against illiteracy. And let's not forget, I'm the son of the man who took away women's veils in Iran. This is a reference to, in 1932, his father, who was then the first Shah of Iran in the modern period, Reza Pahlavi. He forced women to take off the veil in 1932. That made it illegal, and now, of course, it's mandatory after the revolution. So he's pointing to that as a point of pride, essentially saying, that I created a symbol of modern Iranian women. But then he goes on, of course, to be extremely patronizing, saying women are important in a man's life only if they're beautiful and charming and keep their femininity and ... This business of feminism, for instance, what do these feminists want? What do you want? You say equality? Oh, I don't want to seem rude, but you're equal in the eyes of the law, but not, excuse my saying so, ability. So this, I think this has been a lifelong struggle for women in the 20th century to be seen and heard and recognized for their talents, both in artistic ways. Between 1976 and 1979, there was a incredible upsurge in women's activism in Iran, mainly because women were getting educations, university educations, and they were participating alongside men in calls for change inside of Iran. So this is just an image of 1979 of women. But after the revolution of 1979, essentially what happened was there was a power struggle, and the Ayatollah Khomeini and the Islamic parties took control and established then the Islamic Republic of Iran. And in 1981, they passed a law making it mandatory for women to veil. So between 1981 and the early 2000s, ironically, women have experienced incredible empowerment in some areas, i.e. there's greater literacy among women because they're segregated educational institutions. But the downside is that women still have less equality than men. They're unequal to men. They have to wear a veil, and they can't participate in some professions. So one of the byproducts of the revolution has been to create greater literacy among women, therefore more readers, therefore more female writers. And that sort of leads me to where we're going next, which is that some of their political rights eroded, you have an explosion of women writers between basically 1986 and now. And women dominate the fiction market in Iran like they have never done before. And these are a few of the writers who emerged out of the early period of the 1979 revolution. Unfortunately, both of them no longer live in Iran because their books have been banned. Karim PhD wrote a book called Women Without Men, which is a commentary on, I think, male hegemony inside of Iran, and it plays with the idea of women trying to create a utopian space. And Moni Rudavanipour left in the mid-1990s because she won several prizes and went outside the country and at a conference commented, critiqued the Iranian government and its treatment of women, and therefore she was told that her books would no longer be available. So censorship is a big part of the struggle for writers, and especially for women, in terms of what they can and cannot write. And I noticed that, I can't remember who it was, I read an artist statement by one of the painters, I think it was Azadi, talked about how she doesn't show some of her work in Iran because she's concerned that it would be perceived as too sexual, or and that painting right over there would never be able to be shown inside of Iran, obviously. So images of the female body in film, in literature, in visual arts are very limited. So for example, in Iranian films, although they've been very successful and very popular, they have had to adhere to a certain set of standards where you can't show unmarried couples, for example, showing affection in films, and women always have to wear a veil in films. So those are some of the limitations inside of Iran for artists of all sorts, but especially for women, who may very well be interested in writing about their sexuality, their desires, even critiquing a male system. This is a quote, I won't read the whole thing, but essentially what Moni Rudavanipour, who now lives in Las Vegas, is talking about the struggle to be a writer outside of Iran, where she feels that Persian is her language, that she can only write in Persian, and at the same time she's made a choice to leave, and by doing that, in some ways, her audience has really changed. I recently edited a special issue of a magazine called World Literature Today, and I enlisted a friend of mine to interview her, and she said that one of the things she's doing now is she's serializing her novels on Facebook, which is really interesting to me, is that she's trying to maintain a relationship with a reading audience, even though she can't publish to the same extent now that she did when she was in Iran. This is Karim PhD. She lives in the Bay Area near me. Her books have been banned inside of Iran. She, in this book called Women Without Men, she actually has a whole commentary about virginity and how ridiculous the notion of virginity is, and that got her into trouble. So broaching some of these topics, I think, is very concerning, because either you might get past the censors and you might get published, but if somebody objects at some point, your books can be removed from bookstores. So it's a problem for writers, both men and women. I put this up here. This is a visual artist. She's very well known in the U.S. She lives in the U.S. She's been living here for probably 25 to 30 years. She's very interested in the idea of the female body and the idea of the text of the female body. And this is a poem by Farouk Farrokhzad that she's put on her fingers. She's a wonderful photographer, and she's done films, and she did a filmic adaptation of that novel, Women Without Men, which I highly recommend.
if you know no other Iranian artist, you should know Shirin Ashad.
Yeah.
She's like a superstar.
Yeah, she's a rock star. And her pieces sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And she does a very interesting thing in this movie. I really recommend it. It's a beautiful movie. She takes some liberties with the novel, and she really politicized the novel, also in the context of the events of the 2009 Green Movement that took place. Another superstar in the Iranian context, in the writer context, is Marjan Satrapi. She wrote a graphic memoir about her experience of growing up in Iran before the revolution, and then experiencing the revolution as a child, and then moving to France. Has anybody read the book or seen the movie? The movie is pretty good. So I prefer the graphic memoirs, but and this is her work. She does cartooning, and she depicts from the point of view of a child that moment when girls were asked to start wearing the veil in school, and that it was sort of one of those shocking moments in her life where suddenly she had to be covered all the time. And now I'm sort of migrating towards our own context, the U.S., to sort of suggest that as women have experienced both empowerment and disempowerment in Iran, one of the things that I think is really interesting is that women writers have dominated the scene in the U.S. In part, I think, because they can, and because they're writing against a tradition that has been historically dominated by men, and they are free from that by writing in English, by writing for American audiences or English-speaking audiences, and that without the restrictions of censorship or a very harsh male set of peers who might object to some things. And I put her up here because she was in Georgia for a long time. She taught at Georgia College and State University over in Milledgeville. Unfortunately, she passed away in a car accident in Jordan in 2004, I believe. But she was a really wonderful poet, and she wrote a collection of poems called That Kind of Sleep, which deals with going back to Iran and sort of confronting some of the difficulties for her navigating in that society as a female after she'd been living outside of Iran. Mostly her father was a diplomat. So this is a poem that speaks back to Rosa Parks and the idea of women in Iran needing another Rosa Parks. We need another Rosa Parks to pin herself to that front seat and say, I am too old for later. Boro anja, he said, over there. And I turned to see my place among the colored scars behind. My breast warm steel rounds at my ribs. I was half sick of standing there, breathing in wet wool of hair, breathing in their breaths. We are not sheep, I said. We are not sheep. And then this is a collection, Let Me Tell You Where I've Been, New Writing by Women of the Iranian Diaspora. It was the second collection I edited. And because the first anthology that I was involved with came out in 1999, and it was so strange that of the 32 writers, I think only 5 were men. And people would ask me, how come there's so many women and so few men? And I jokingly replied, well, men are too busy being doctors and lawyers and engineers, because many of the Iranian immigrants who came to this country, both before 79 and after 79, were driven by an interest in those professions. But for women who were not necessarily expected to be the sole supporters of families, but who also weren't encouraged in many respects to pursue those professions, there became an opening for women to actually produce art and literature. So the second anthology I worked on I just said, wow, you know, there's something going on with the huge number of women who are writing. So I collected writing exclusively by women in this second collection. The other thing that happened between mid-1980s and the early 2000s was there was an explosion in the genre of memoir by Iranian women writers, and I assign that to two things. One, I think people had an image, Americans had an image of Iran and had an image of Iranian women as being covered in a veil and unable to speak or assert themselves, and therefore the publishing industry was sort of fascinated with the idea of getting under the veil and allowing women to speak. And the second thing is I think this is a phenomenon that is very much a part of immigrant literature, is that the first wave of writing is often the first person memoir or autobiography, and as time goes on, people pursue other genres. But it really, it was like every time I opened my eyes, there was another memoir. So that trend has really slowed a great deal, but you can see this was the kind of representation. And probably the most famous of them was Reading Lolita in Tehran, a memoir and books by Azadi, where she explores the idea of reading and the power of reading Western narratives in an Iranian context, and also some of the gendered ways that Iranian women have to deal with knowledge and education. So that trend has really shifted to fiction and poetry, and this is the collection that I edited with a friend of mine 2 years ago, partly because I kept seeing now people are moving away from memoir towards fiction, and there's a lot of really outstanding writing now being written that both reflects some of the issues of leaving Iran and coming to the U.S. and being under the shadow of post 9/11, and also 35 plus years of bad news about Iran, which you can't, if you have any connection to that country, it's hard not to feel affected by it. Because I have family in Iran, I often feel like, you know, we experience it through the media as a very dark, unhappy, dangerous place, and it's a much more complicated place than that, and people are much more complicated. So in some ways, my interest has been to try and give a more complicated portrayal to Iranians, especially to Iranians in this country. What I call the double vision of Iranian-American writers has a lot of thematic similarities, dealing with migration and war, the 8-year-long war between Iran and Iraq, alienation in the West, dealing with stereotypes, intergenerational challenges between parents and children, people writing more openly about sex and sexuality, writing against a perception of Iran, reclaiming Iranian history and Iranian ideas, and also people who are going back to Iran and writing about that experience, and then also experimenting with aesthetics, including things like magical realism. And I think that's it. That's the context for some of this writing, and I think that speaks in some ways to this idea of the hybrid nature of this literature. And I thought maybe I would read you a few of my own poems to maybe familiarize you a little bit with some of my work. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
Wonderful.
Do you like poetry?
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll find out.
Okay.
Enjoy, they don't understand.
Okay, well, you can ask me if you don't understand. Okay, I'm going to read you this poem that I wrote probably like 20 years ago called Hybrid. Because I grew up with it, my father was a wonderful guy, but he was in some ways a very traditionally Iranian father, you know, that he had certain ideas about
how we were supposed to be as children. And I remember I wrote this poem, and I showed him the book when it came out, and he said, "That's me?" So it's called Hybrid. By the time I figured out what made an Iranian girl good, it was too late. I had already been corrupted by America. Her loose hips and ungracious manner had watered me down. I couldn't even be called Iranian-American. I lacked the sensibility, the language, the distaste for body hair, and the desire for a small nose. It was too late. I'd already become something else and couldn't read the codes one needs to function as an Iranian. It was bad enough that I had 4 brothers and a mother who was not glamorous. I had learned to curse and cared more about grades than boys. Occasionally, when I didn't do what he wanted, my father reminded me that I was too American, a phrase that cut like a dagger against the skin, separated me out and drove a wedge between us. I could never quite figure out how much was too American. Did he mean, don't disrespect your parents, tell them everything, don't sleep with a boy before marriage, don't give yourself too easily? Did he mean that my American part should not disobey his law? It was too late. Like all immigrant parents, he wants me to succeed, to get an education, to be smart and beautiful, but not to forget that I had to find a man. Women are like fruit trees, he said. They have to bear children or they'll wither. When he put it like that, all I wanted was to be one of those hybrid ornamental plums whose blossoms are sweet but fall to the ground without ever bearing fruit. You understood that, right?
Oh my goodness.
Very good.
Okay, I'm going to read you a couple other poems. One is about pomegranates. I'm crazy about pomegranates. I have a pomegranate necklace. I grew up in California, and my parents planted, we grew up in a suburban town outside of San Francisco, and my parents planted all kinds of trees that were from the Mediterranean. My dad just loved landscaping and loved fruit trees. So we had pomegranates in our yard, and not very many people grew pomegranates, and nobody knew what to do with them. So when this craze about pomegranates happened about, I don't know, 15 years ago, I was like, what's the big deal? You know, we've been eating pomegranates forever. And many people think that it was a really clever marketing ploy to get people to eat something that they had no connection with. But the real reason I wrote this poem was because the cover of the first anthology has a pomegranate. You can see it outside. It's green. It's a really beautiful cover. My cousin, who's a painter who lives in Iran, made it for me because she noticed that there were lots of poems in the collection, or there were lots of images of pomegranates. And then after the book came out, people started sending me like pomegranate jewelry, pomegranate cards, little pomegranate sculptures, and I was like, wow, it's like there's this hidden pomegranate lust that I've sort of unleashed with this book cover. So I anointed myself the pomegranate queen, and I decided to write this poem. And this is in memory of my father, who taught me how to eat pomegranates. To root themselves in their new home, Mother and Baba planted native trees, madrone, oak, and the manzanita at the end of the drive. To remind them of their foreignness, they planted olive, almond, quince, pomegranate. The first time my mother packed one in my lunch, I shrank in embarrassment, quickly returning the leathery bulb to the brown bag. How to eat a pomegranate without being conspicuous? It is a slow and exacting endeavor, an act of worship. You never slice them with a knife, Baba would say, when the September heat made the trees sag with the ornaments of autumn. In his world, men sold them on the streets for a few tumans, shouting, "Enare khoshmazeh," delicious pomegranates, rolling sun-flushed hides between their palms. Customers at the corner of the cart kneaded, coaxed the last of the blood-red juice from a hole, allowing it to touch only their lips. Our American sensibility refused this technique. We never took their exotic form for granted. "Throw them in the air, let them crack open," my brothers yelled, waiting for the quiet thud and then the invisible seam that split them open like an unhealed wound. I like the splatter of color on face and hands, evidence of pomegranate carnage. In my 20s, I understood the fecund symbol. A health magazine in the waiting room advised women wanting to conceive, eat estrogen-rich foods, shrimp, scallops, pomegranates. Like the larvae of a magical butterfly, the red ovules offered a cure for barren women. There are two kinds of people in the world, those who pluck the seeds from the waxy yellow membrane, tossing them into their mouths, and those who hoard the ruby jewels, jealously guarding the pile until the last kernel is extracted. Once in a child's game of war, my brother plucked a pomegranate, tore its feathery crown, and with a heave mimicked the sound of a grenade exploding with his mouth full of saliva. Bury it, I said, looking at its inedible remains. Baba would not tolerate such sacrilege. When I learned the Sephardic version of the fall, that it was a pomegranate and not an apple, I felt a kind of secret pride. This fall, my son, undaunted, eats his first pomegranate. His tiny probing fingers harvest the seeds, one by one. With hands stained by this baptism, he offers them to me like the remnants of an untold story inherited in the womb. I'm going to read you...
Can I tell you something about pomegranates on the show? We have a speaker. She was born in Jordan, and she's a student here now. She went to her family moved here when she was pretty young, mid-10. But her last name is Roman, which in Arabic is pomegranate. So we've been talking about pomegranates now for weeks. Talking about pomegranates. We also have a visitor, a student who's in the Education First program. I didn't catch his name, but he's Saudi, and he was talking on and on about pomegranates. And so I think pomegranates they're important in different areas of the Middle East, and they're much more prevalent.
They're very important because
beautiful symbol.
Yeah, they're a beautiful symbol. They have sort of a mythic quality. They actually are associated with fertility, and I didn't know this until I read this article in the doctor's office. Like I had heard, like, eat pomegranates because they're like abundance, right? Well, it turns out they actually are one of the highest estrogen-producing fruits in the fruit family. So, but it's also like it's an absolutely beautiful fruit. I mean, the flower is beautiful, the fruit is beautiful, the fruit is beautiful when it opens. In California, there's a farm near Davis, California, that they have the largest collection of pomegranate species, 230, I think, in the world, which came from a Soviet scientist who ended up leaving the Soviet Union and immigrated to Israel, and he donated his collection to this farm in Davis. It's an experimental farm. So I go up there every November. They have a tasting, and it's just like an aesthetically wonderful experience. Thanks for that. I'm going to read you a couple more. This one's called In Praise of Big Noses. Iranians have, like many Middle Eastern people, they have a propensity to have large noses, and the poem speaks for itself. In Praise of Big Noses. I am the only one of 4 sisters who hasn't gone under the knife. I resisted the pleas of my aunt and sisters to become more beautiful, more you. I've kept my stately proboscis intact, choosing not to excise its grandeur. It suits me, I suppose, evidence of my father, those people who live in the drier, hotter climes of the Mediterranean, in high desert plateaus, cooling themselves with nasothermo regulation. My old Jewish boyfriend used to say, how do the Goyim breathe from those things anyway? On my wedding day, my husband, also Jewish and rather plentiful in that region of his face, completed his vows by saying, there is no guarantee in love, but of this I am certain. If we have a child, he or she will have a really big nose. By the way, my son is a teenager and it's starting to happen. When I nuzzle him with mine, he pulls back his face, jumps at the coldness of its tip. Contrary to popular belief, the nose is not merely cosmetic. It can gauge temperature beyond the body. And that's another thing I've realized about the nose, that smell is an underrated sense, perhaps a gift. Imagine the possibilities for amplification. Aromas of jasmine, apple pie, saffron, lemon, rose might grow more intense depending on the height and angle of that fleshy mound. I admit to having no evidence for this, but I do wonder what happens when a person alters the thing with which they are born. Whole industries were born from Iranian women watching blonde, petite-nosed movie stars who made them forget their own striking beauty took thousands of years, only to be undone by someone who decided that hairless, plucked, tucked, sliced, nipped, and trimmed were loveliest of all. I like to think of the nose as great art waiting to be discovered, like large-nosed kings depicted on sides of temples, on papyrus, on caves, and colorful Mayan pictographs, like Popol Vuh. Noses were signs of nobility and prowess. Any king with a puny one might have been thought of as small and impotent. These days, I get a steady stream of emails offering penis enlargement, but that's all hidden, visible only in bedroom interludes. The nose is the public display of one's endowments, the relief map of a human face. I study people's noses in order to read their origins, to situate my gaze, to find out how far in the world they really are. I'm going to read you a poem called The Execution of Oglethorpe. Unfortunately, the human rights record of the Iranian government has been not very favorable towards, well, many people, but especially towards women, and many of the laws privilege men and men's testimony over women. And this poem was inspired after I read about a young woman who was 16 who was executed in 2004 because she was allegedly engaged in an adulterous relationship. It later came out that she was mentally ill, but she was still executed. And their record of executions, both of political activists and people who violate the laws in some way, is pretty atrocious. So this poem came from that news of Oglethorpe's execution. For Oglethorpe Rajabi, age 16, executed by the mullahs, Iran, 2004. She was a tired girl trapped in a woman's mind, thinking of cigarettes and sex on tender afternoons. She couldn't help herself. Her anger resided at the tip of her tongue and the color of her lips. First, she gave herself to the boy next door, then later to a man twice her age. The reports say she was mentally incompetent. When she faced the judges for acts incompatible with chastity, her quiet state of madness grew louder. She spoke against her accusers, lashing her tongue 100 times against the body of men wrapped in white cloth and holiness. Weeks later, her body hung from a rope tied to a crane in Mecca Square. Beneath the black folds of cloth that would erase her, those passing by saw the scorn in her past virgin face. They made themselves feel better, speaking under their breath. She was a whore, a temptress, a victimizer of men. That night, her body lay in the hot, humid ground. Someone, perhaps the men, dug her up, fearful that her skin and bones might eat away at the soft earth where mortal saviors walk. She has risen again, some say, given her body over to the flight of souls, to watchful eyes that entreat us to remember the body from which we came.
I think I like the other people there.
Oh,
Yes.
Yeah.
Is that one in one of your in charge?
Yes. Yeah, it's and then I'm going to end with a poem that was inspired by one of those paintings back there, the one in the middle.
By Afrin Nolan.
Yeah, by Afarin Raman. One of the things that I think is important about all of this work is that it's really attending to the idea of women's voices and women's storytelling capability as both painters, but also as people who are claiming a tradition for themselves as visual artists. And of course, one of the greatest storytellers of all time is Sherazade from the 1001 Nights. Does everybody know the story? That essentially she was held prisoner by the king, who every night took a different woman, and then once he was finished with her, would murder her and then get another one. And Sherazade was elected to be his concubine, and then she started telling a story, and night after night she told a story, and it kept her alive. And it's the capacity, I think, it appeals to me, and I think to many people, is the power of storytelling, but also the power of storytelling to save our lives. And I think especially in an Iranian context, that assertion of being a storyteller is a very important thing, and it's been an important part of the work I've been involved with. So this is called The Storyteller. Inside the envelope of her heart, she holds the secret of another's story. Night after night, she seduces him, her body a vessel for words, her voice a string of notes that play like a lullaby, holding him enraptured like a man, like a baby, against the breast of her being. He does not know it yet, but her conquest begins in her invocation to speak, to not let him write her story of body and body only. She unravels him, the idea of him, this king perched on the bedside, believing he is holding her prisoner. She knows she is the warden, the master, her key, the blue imagination of her conjuring and conniving, where night after night she gives him just enough to want the beginning and end of everything, and to know it begins in her, in this body of woman. Thank you. I don't know if anybody has any questions or comments. I'm happy to engage with you. Yes?
In many of your recap of different books, there was a reflection on the diaspora.
Yes.
What is the context of that? Is that just because of people going from Iran to America, or is it?
Yeah, well, you know, historically the word diaspora has been associated with the Jewish diaspora. But in the modern 20th century, I think we can see that there are large migrations of people from one place to another, largely as a result of war and major social upheaval, revolution. The word diaspora, I think, has been used more recently with Iran because at the point of the revolution, between 1979 and 1981, more than 3.5 million people left Iran. Many of those people didn't think that they were leaving permanently. They were like, oh, this is going to blow over. But eventually, people came to terms with the idea like that government was going to stay. And it was such a huge change for people. Politically, economically, many of the people who left were upper class people who had, you know, close association with the previous government. But many people also left because the war took place between Iran and Iraq, and the economy was almost in ruins by the end of the war. So that large exodus of people in that short a time, you know, a 5-year period, had a huge impact both on Iran, but also on places like Los Angeles, where now there's probably close to, I don't know what the exact number is, but it's close to 1 million Iranians now live in the Los Angeles area. Like they even call West LA Tehrangeles. And the idea that, you know, people can't go back very easily. I mean, people go back and forth, but because of the changes in the government and because of the restrictions on travel, and because there's been a kind of a condemnation of any pro-Western sensibilities, at least in the first decade of the revolution, people were frightened to go back. I mean, there were mass executions of communists, of leftists, people who were perceived of being enemies of this new government. So it was very dangerous for people to go back. And then, of course, because of the war, many people didn't want to go back because their children would be drafted into this war. So the concept of the diaspora, I think, is also an ongoing one because there have been a series of major political events in Iran since the end of the Iran-Iraq War. There was a student uprising in the mid-90s, and many students left. And then in 2009, when there was the contested election, another wave of Iranians left. So there's been an ongoing steady stream of Iranians departing to move to places like the United States, France, Germany, Sweden, Australia. And in some ways, they're really representative, I think, of other populations. But
There's
because
still
of
80 million left, I think.
yeah, there's still a lot left, and they're a lot younger.
More to go.
Yeah.
Do you ever go back?
Here's the thing. My father left in 1947, so by Iranian law, I'm considered an Iranian. So I've been trying to get. I have to travel on an Iranian passport, so I haven't even been there. I have a lot of family there who I communicate with, but this year I think I'm a little more optimistic because of the negotiations that are taking place. I'm really hopeful that things are going to change between the U.S. and Iran. I mean, I think the other reason why we call it a diaspora is if you think about the condition with which Iran has been viewed in the United States, and also the idea that this tension has been ongoing, it's made Iranians have to really choose in a way that I think other populations, when you leave and you feel like you can go back and forth, it's really psychically different than people who feel like it's not so easy. You're vilified in this country, and then you're vilified when you go over there. So I think it really it's a unique situation. I mean, the only parallel I can think of is Cuba, is one that I would say is similar, where there's this like ongoing tension, and also that's going to hopefully resolve itself for the better.
One of the authors that you mentioned is who left because her books were banned. I was thinking of, and she said something about, in her long quote, toward the end of it, mentioned writing in Persian, and does that even make sense? She's thinking of speaking in English, all of this. I think you mentioned something about writing and putting works online. So I guess it's kind of a hybrid question, because I know for authors it can be problematic to try to put work out there on social media.
Yeah.
But what do you see happening from Iran and from Tehran with the current generation and how they might be using social media? I'm also thinking of Tara Talakasan, whose work is on view here, and she's got a new show opening that's called Not an Arab Spring. But, obviously social media is it's going to be part of our lives, and it's continuing to be, and it has effects on politics, writing, everything.
Yeah.
Do you think the current generation is staying because they can connect?
I think that the reason Iran is actually even negotiating right now is because it sees its future imperiled by the idea that there's a population of more than 75% of the younger generation. So I forget what the statistic is, but I think it's like 65% of the population of Iran is under the age of 35. And you have a leadership that is over the age of 70. And I think that what they see is like, we can't continue unless we have some way to like open up our country economically, politically, to the whole world. So I think it's a survival thing for this regime, because they recognize that what happened in 2009 when that popular protest occurred, and what happened in the in 1995 when there was like a massive student protest was that they started to understand like we can't continue to like be isolated from the world because these young people are connected. They're super connected. I mean, Iran has the highest percentage of bloggers in the Middle East, and I think it's the number 3 in the world. So they're active in terms of social media in a way that's probably, you know, pushing the envelope politically. And Iran does sometimes censor the media, you know, the social media, but they've never done anything like what Egypt did. Like Egypt unplugged it, and they've never done as bad a thing as like the flogging of the Saudi guy. Can't remember his name. You know, 1,000 lashes. But they have arrested bloggers. They have arrested people who are critical of the government. But I think it's a really important part of this generation in Iran, and it's creating the aspiration to be connected, and also because Iran's economy is in trouble, both as a result of the sanctions and a lot of corruption under Ahmadinejad. It's also an economic thing. And also Iran is a major player in the Middle East now. I mean, the Arab Spring has really turned out badly, and one of the people who's come out on top, unfortunately, maybe, is Iran. And so they are negotiating, and I think it's a great thing. You know, I mean, some people will disagree with me, but I think it's the only way that we have to both build a relationship with Iran and to maybe control Iran's political future around at least a nuclear weapon. And it's a huge population. It's like you can't ignore it. But there's a lot of people who want to get in on the market. It's a huge market. People are dying. I mean, I live close to Silicon Valley. People are dying to get in there and use that pool of consumers. So it's not all noble politics.
160 million shoes.
Shoes? Yeah. Yeah, and other things too. Any other questions? Well, I hope that was interesting and relevant to the work, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you for